But what I want to talk about today, and Dean Snell's introduction set it up very, very well, talk about what do we know about the science of hominid evolution so we can sort of speculate on what that means for us as human persons, right? So what do we know, and then that can help inform our speculation on what and how humans came to be in the way that they are, okay? So to start, I always like to start when I give talks on evolution with two quotes from Pope Benedict, right? The first one is from his inaugural homily when he was installed as Pope in 2004. He says, "We are not some casual, meaningless product of evolution. Each of us is the result of the thought of God. Each of us is willed. Each of us is loved. Each of us is necessary." And I think in this quote, if it's taken out of context, it seems like Benedict is setting up a dichotomy. Well, there's either evolution where you are a meaningless product of a material process, or you are loved and willed and providentially wanted by God, right? But what Benedict here is in his homily cautioning against is the idea that evolution is a philosophy, that evolution can explain the totality of man, the totality of everything, that science has the ability to explain all, that's scientism. And that's something that not only Benedict warns against, but Pope Pius, all the popes since Pope Pius wrote Humani Generis have warned against, right? And I think to Benedict proper, the quote that I love, and this one is the way that I'm approaching this talk, is a quote from his book In the Beginning, which I think you may have read, right? This quote, where he talks about creation and evolution as two complementary ways of knowing, right? So he says, you cannot say creation or evolution as much as these things correspond to two different realities. He says the Genesis creation account does not explain how human persons come to be, but rather what they are. What is a human person, right? So it's answering a different question than the scientific question that the theory of evolution seeks to understand, which is to describe biological developments. So he says we're faced with two complementary rather than mutually exclusive realities, right? And they're only complementary, though, if we have a proper understanding of evolution and creation, right? So I teach evolution class at Franciscan, I teach the science of faith class, and students come in with all kinds of ideas of what creation means and what evolution means, right? So I want to sort of unpack those first, but I just want to give you an overview of where we're going, right? So the first is I want to unpack very briefly the meanings of creation and evolution, what I'm referring to them, right? And then I want to talk about order, chance, and purpose in evolution, right? Because often people see evolution as just a chance, random process, and then that is no, in some extent, not compatible in their minds with a loving, providential creator. And so how do we unpack that? Some of that Corey and Father Terry talked about yesterday, sort of the philosophical way to unpack that. But I'm going to talk about how evolution is actually, the order in creation is actually foundational for evolution to work at all, and in some sense directs evolution along certain pathways. Right? So we'll talk about the philosophical issue with this, but most of my talk will be on the scientific data. Right? And then at the end, I want to set up to talk about human evolution. Right? And we'll talk about going from hominids to modern humans. And I'll make the distinction between biological and theological humans, and you'll see how complex the science is, and then use that to try to get some calibration of where and how did humans emerge. And then at the end, because somebody always asks this question, I just put it into the talk, we'll talk about monogenism and polygenism, and what the church has talked about that, and why, what the science says about that, and we can sort of speculate a little bit on that. Okay. So the first thing I want to do is talk about creation from a Catholic perspective. What I mean? Right? So I'm not a theologian, don't claim to be, but I do want to point out a couple truths of creation that I don't think, in no way, what I talk about with evolution is going to be conflicting. Right? So there's three sort of key things. There's many more things in the Catholic understanding of creation, but three things that I think are important to keep in mind as you talk about evolution. Right? The first is that we owe our existence to God. So humans, we owe our existence to God. God deliberately intended to create us. Right? It was a particular event. It's not as if God is up there, started an evolutionary process, looks down about 300,000 years ago, wow, look at that hairy hominid running around in Africa. That's pretty cool. I think I'll give that person a soul, right? No, it is from the very beginning of time. That is the purpose of creation, was that humans were going to come into existence to be made in the image and likeness of God. It wasn't an accident, right? However it comes to be, it was intended from all eternity, right? And the second point is that God created man in his image, right? And this is the beautiful line in Genesis where God forms man from the dust of the earth and breathes his life into him, right? You have this image of God, of man as a physical being with the spirit, this combination, this unity of two things, right? And what that tells us is, that line, I think, for our scientists, is that science will never be able to explain the totality of the human person, right? That's the thing to take away, right? Science is going to be able to explain quite a bit about the physical nature of the human being, why we look the way we do, why we have certain behaviors that we share with other primates and so forth, but it's not going to be able to explain the totality. It's not going to be able to explain the spirit of man, the man's soul, right? So understanding the limits of science, I think, is important as we approach this question. Okay? So those are the two key points that I did have three before, but I cut out of one. So these are probably the two that are most important with understanding human evolution, which is where we're eventually going to get to. Okay? All right. So what I want to do in the next few slides is just to set up what I mean by evolution, and particularly to understand what and the evolutionary process and what the scientists mean by that, and how that's our understanding of that, in particular, has evolved over the last 20 years in particular. Okay, there's a lot of new things that we've sort of uncovered about how nature works, right? So when I talk about evolution, when you talk about it from a scientific perspective, right? This is what I'm not. There's these philosophical ideas that are married with evolution, like this atheistic idea that our evolution is, this atheistic, materialistic process. So we're putting that to the side. We're talking about purely a scientific understanding of evolution. I talk about distinguish sort of three levels of evolution, which I think are important because different pieces of evidence are going to support different levels of evolution. It's kind of like a wedding cake, right? So you have a base layer that's most foundational, right? And you have to support that first, and if you do, then you can move up to the next level. And then there's going to be some evidence for that, then you can move up to the next level, right? So the base level is what I call historical evolution, right? And that is just the idea that the Earth is old, the universe is old, and the creatures that have existed on the Earth have changed over time. The Earth is roughly 4.5 billion years old. If you go back and look at rocks that are a billion years old, you're going to find a different set of organisms than you do 500 million years ago, right? And that is basically well established from different radiometric dating techniques, right? And so if you could demonstrate that these fossils are a certain age, that's going to set up, you know, the demonstration that historical evolution is the best understanding of how the Earth has evolved over time. Right? Now, the second level is common descent. So historical evolution, I don't think there's any necessary conflict between the Catholic faith and historical evolution, as long as you don't try to understand Genesis as a literal text. But when you do, that case, you do violence to both the science and to the theology. So it's like a double homicide. Okay? You're reading the Genesis text in a way that's not meant to be read, and then you are doing violence to the science. You know, if you, I read creationist websites just to see what their theories are, and they're all basically are ad hoc ideas of how, you know, the different constants have changed over time with absolutely no evidence that, you know, radioactive decay sped up really fast and slow, and that's why these dates are so old and so forth. So it's a lot of sort of ad hominem ideas. Okay? So common descent is the second level, right? Common descent evolution. The idea that all living organisms are united by common descent, right? The common descent doesn't explain the mechanism. How does species A give rise to species B? But it does say that we're all connected in some way. And the evidence for this is largely, I think the best evidence for this is a huge swath of evidence. The best evidence is largely in genetic defects that are shared amongst related species. So if you look at some of the genetic defects that are shared amongst all the different primates, I refer to most parsimonious explanation for that. Around it, the simplest and most straightforward way is that. Now, I think from a Catholic perspective, like nobody really cares if you know, fish gave rise to tetrapods, by common descent. You know, it doesn't threaten your theological understanding usually. The one area where it becomes problematic for a lot of students is going from a hominid to human, right? And so we'll address that at the end. How does that process work? Okay? So the last level, and this is the one I think is most interesting and often the most misunderstood, is what I call Darwinian evolution at the top. And this is where you're trying to explain common descent. What are the mechanisms, what are the processes which allow or feed the change in species over time? Okay? The idea that you have a way of explaining common descent through a natural means. Okay? So first of all, I just want to briefly mention what is natural selection, and then talk about some other processes that help augment natural selection. So it's sort of understanding sort of what are the modern mechanisms that people uncovered about the evolution process. Right, a lot of times when people think of natural selection is an emergent process. Right? It is. It's not something where somebody or something is selecting for things, but it is just the emergent process. Anytime you have physical organisms in a world that has limited resources, there's going to be natural selection over time. All right. So it emerges from dynamic interactions between a lot of different things. Okay? And in most textbooks, you'll have sort of a simple explanation of it that I have up here. I'll talk about some more a broader explanation of it in the next couple slides. It's the idea that if you have individuals in a population that vary, if you look around the room, you can see obviously everybody in this room varies quite a bit. Some of that variability is heritable. We passed on through your genetics. Not all your variability is heritable. Some of it is environmentally determined. Right? Some of that is heritable. And that some individuals in each generation are going to have different levels of time. The population is going to change over time. Right? And this is, again, requires populations interacting with their environment and having a certain set of resources in their environment. This is really the classic example there. You see giraffes, and you have these different neck sizes. There's reproduction, maybe the ones that have a longer neck are able to have more offspring. So in the next generation, the population has changed so that on average, the neck length is longer. Okay? Now, one of the interesting things about this is that natural. So why? That's the question. Why would having a longer neck be beneficial for a giraffe? Right? Okay, so everybody says like better access to food. That is, the common answer. You say, right, you got a long neck. You reach up, you can get some leaves at the top of the tree, right? What's the trade-off of that? Getting the blood up to the head, right? Have you ever seen a giraffe drink? Yeah, put their leg, it's like tip it over. They're very, very vulnerable. So you have trade-offs, right? So there's limits to, again, how long the giraffe neck is going to be. So you would expect that there's got to be some strong selective pressure for keeping the neck long, right? And it makes intuitive sense that it's long because it's going to be helpful for eating leaves. But as a scientist, you have to demonstrate that. You can't just say, that obviously makes sense. That doesn't mean it's correct. Okay? It turns out that the evidence suggests that the reason that a giraffe's necks are long is not to eat leaves. Right? So I have a picture up here. This is a study, and it's by, I can't imagine being a grad student of this study. They went out into the Serengeti, and basically they followed giraffes around, and they marked where they were eating leaves, right? And so you can see here the female giraffes and the male giraffes here. So every time they ate, they would mark it here. And you can see most of the time they ate, they were bending their neck down, right? And very seldom did they reach up. And every time they reached up, there was also plenty of leaves down here. So they would just seem to be, I'm going to reach up now. And you can see in the females, almost all the leaves they were below their neck. So it didn't seem that, at least in the current context, that the reason that the giraffe's neck was long was for feeding behavior, right? So they did another study where they looked at reproductive or access to females, and see if this video works. If not, I'm going to have to all right. Here we go.
Oh, yes.
So there are two male giraffes, right? And
Oh.
what did I do here? Going.
The giraffes broke it.
But this is what bull giraffes do and how they compete for females, right? So actually having a longer neck generates more whiplash, more force, and you're able to defeat your rivals. And so it's a mating behavior that it seems to be the reason that giraffes, at least currently, have these long necks, right? And the cost of losing is skull fractures and death often. So it's not a, it's a relatively violent activity. Now, I bring that up just so that you can get an appreciation for how difficult it is to understand the evolutionary process, right? I mean, that's a lot of work to send grad students out in the field to measure where they're eating leaves, send them out to measure the fights that are going on. And even then, you still don't know how and why, what was the selective pressure that made the giraffe's neck, or that helped create an environment where having a long neck was beneficial, right? So currently, it seems that the reason that they're long is to help make, for mating behavior. But when they evolved 60 million years ago, there could have been a different reason, right? So it could have been feeding behavior 60 million years ago. And now that they have a long neck, it's also beneficial for this, and this is what maintains it. So the key here with natural selection is recognizing how the environment changes over time, and that's going to drive different changes in the organism. Okay? Now, one other notion that I want to sort of correct about natural selection. There's often a perception that natural selection works and the organism is a passive player in this, right? So there's a mutation, and a small mutation in the organism just takes the mutation and changes gradually over time, right? But as we understand the evolutionary process, we realize that the organisms play a very active role in this, okay? And there are a lot of ways in which the organisms help drive evolutionary processes. It's not a one-way street. The organisms are just waiting for change, genetic change to happen to them. Organisms respond to genetic change and respond to the environment in ways that influence the environment, which then influence them or influence their offspring. So there's a lot of other mechanisms that can change organismal form over time, rather than just passively waiting for mutations to take place. I just want to talk about a couple. I've listed a whole bunch of them up here. I just want to talk about a couple, just so you can understand sort of the complexity that's involved, and again, the ability that organisms have to deal with their environment and how that shapes evolutionary change. Right. So genetic change, for the most part, is a chance process, right? So the genetic change that organisms undergo during their lifespan of their germline is largely a chance process. They don't get to choose, I want to have this mutation, and then mutate that one and see how it responds. But the organism's response to that is anything but random. Right? Organisms respond in very predictable ways to mutations, and they can sort of, the organismal form can influence the way that mutations affect the organism, right? So for example, there's this field of evolutionary biology called evo-devo. It's evolutionary biology and developmental biology put together, right? And there's this, a lot of really cool experiments that have been done in this field that show what's called facilitated variation. Okay? So what this is when you're during embryonic development, right? Probably the key event of embryonic development is figuring out where you're going to put the head, where you're going to put the tail, where's right, where's left, where's dorsal and ventral, right? Once you have that in the vertebrae, then the next thing is where's the limb? So you have these limb buds that start to develop the limbs, right? Now, how do you get variations of the limb bone, right? You think, okay, well, I have to have a mutation that changes the bone structure, and then I have to have another mutation that changes the muscles, I need another mutation that changes the tendons, and so forth. But what actually happens is that the exact way in which the limb bone developed isn't genetically programmed. What you have programmed is a sort of a system to respond to the environment and build a limb based upon genetic signals and environmental signals. So what you can have is a single mutation that adds a new bone to a limb, right? And you think, okay, well, that's not going to work because you've got to develop the muscles there and the tendons. But the way that bone develops, it sends out signals to the cells in the limb bud to build muscles around it and build ligaments around it, right? So all you need is a single mutation, a simple single mutation, have a new limb, and the whole musculature. Now, it may not work, it may not be beneficial, but at least you get more than just a bone, right? And so this is an interesting experiment with zebrafish where they have a single mutation, and you can see this is the normal bone structure, and a single amino acid change, one amino acid change, and you get two new bones here. And these bones now are actually integrated. There's joints, there's tendons, there's muscles around this. So it is not this facilitated variation is the sense that the limb bud is this nonlinear dynamic structure that can accommodate change rather than, oh, the change and then it needs more change, but it actually responds to that change and incorporates it, right? And so these processes are going to help the organism respond and evolve over time, right? Another sort of example is the environmental plasticity that organisms have, right? So we often think, okay, here's the genetic program of the organism. This is the phenotype it's going to have, right? But in reality, the phenotype is going to be different depending on the environment, right? And so there's another experiment with a type of fish where they raise them in a very shallow water environment. So they actually have to be able to push off the sand to move across the aquarium. And during their development, they develop larger bones in their fins because of sort of the feedback during development, right? And so there is this developmental plasticity that can help explore sort of evolutionary space, right? So this way in which the organisms are sort of integrated into the evolutionary process is much more dynamic than just sitting there waiting for change to occur. So what you have, I think, is you have this organism that is responding to the environment. Now there's certain things that aren't going to change, right? So I have the physical laws here and chemical laws there. Every organism has to deal with gravity. Every organism has to deal with carbon, right? And the way in which hydrophobic and hydrophilic interact. Some things like water, other things don't. Organisms have to deal with that, right? So that's not going to change. But all these other things are going to change, and they're a two-way street, right? So the organism is going to affect the other members of its species. The other members of the species are going to affect the organism, right? The organism is going to affect its environment, and the environment is going to affect the organism, right? And the same thing with the other species there. And the organism actually can affect itself, right? So you have a much more sort of emergent holistic process that's going on here with evolution, which goes beyond, there's still selection going on, but the ability to build new forms is much more robust than this sort of passive idea that the organism is just waiting for change. And I think that's sort of an important thing to keep in mind. That said, chance certainly plays a role in evolution, right? And so this is where I want to transition to talking about how you understand chance and the actual role of chance, right, in evolution. So you have two sort of aspects of chance in the evolutionary process. First, you have the aspect of mutations or change, right? So this particular gene being mutated, that's a chance event, right? There's a probability that might occur, but you're never sure if it's going to occur, right? There's a chance element. So if that mutation never occurs, it's never going to be selected for, right? The other chance, element of chance, is environmental chance, right? So if you look 65 million years ago, there was a major extinction event on it, right? And what caused that most likely was an asteroid hitting the Yucatan Peninsula, right, in Mexico. There is what's called a KT event, right? That is a chance event, right? And so if that doesn't happen, that chance event, maybe that pushes evolution down a different pathway. I'll argue that wouldn't actually push evolution down a different pathway, but it would change certain things. But there's clearly elements of chance going on in the evolutionary process. Okay? So how then do you reconcile that with purpose? Right? And that's the next sort of set of slides I want to look at. Right? So I get this argument from students, I see this argument from friends, I see this argument on new creationist websites. The idea that evolution must be without a plan. And Father Terry put up some great quotes yesterday about this argument, right? Evolution must be without a plan or purpose because at its core mechanism, right, natural selection of phenotypes that occur via chance in environments that are influenced by chance events. So how can there be purpose and a point to this whole process if it's just chance playing out, right? And there's two responses that we need to give to that. The first has already been given by Corey and Father Terry, right? So I'm not going to not go over that much. And that's the philosophical response. That's actually the more important one, right? How do Catholics integrate chance and purpose? Right? The philosophical need to integrate chance and providence. I'll just touch on that briefly. Okay. The second, though, I think for me as a biologist is more interesting, right? And that is that evolution is an interplay between order and chance. And often people put chance at the top, like evolution is a chance process. Maybe there's a little bit of order in that. I think the exact opposite, right? Evolution is a very ordered process, and the chance is secondary, right? The chance in evolution, I think, is there to uncover the underlying order that is there inherent in the natural world, right? So I'm going to make that argument. First, I just want to reiterate what Corey talked about yesterday and what Father Terry talked about. And that's that philosophical response, right? So the main way that we incorporate chance and purpose is this idea of primary and secondary causality, right? So chance events are not outside of the scope of God. So this asteroid only is doing what asteroids do because God allows asteroids to do what they do. The Earth is only able to do what it does because God allows planets to do what they do to exist. Those things, by chance, bump into each other, but that is, in a sense, is something that God has known from all eternity and is planned from all eternity, because anything that happens, it only happens because of God's primary causality. So I'm not going to go into, you did enough of that yesterday. If you got a question, you can talk to Corey. Okay, all right. But I do want to talk about this. This is a quote from late Ernest Mullen. Because I think this is something I think my students struggle with a lot, and I think this quote helps a lot. And that is, we always try to anthropomorphize God, right? And that's normal. We are humans, we anthropomorphize everything, right? With a dog, that's how we view the world. But that can lead to sort of misunderstandings of how God interacts with the world, right? And so the idea of chance doesn't make sense for a being that is atemporal, outside of time, right? Chance is only something that we encounter as we walk through the world in a temporal fashion, right? So he says it makes no difference. And he's talking about the appearance of humans, right? If the appearance of humans is the inevitable result of a steady process of complexification stretching out over billions of years. Okay, so he says, okay, this is the idea that the humans, the evolution was pre-programmed, it's predestined to get to everything. If you saw a random over and over again, you would always get the humans. Or, on the contrary, it comes through a series of coincidences or chance events that would be entirely unpredictable from the human standpoint. Either way, the outcome is God's making, and from the biblical standpoint, it could probably be said to be God's plan. So terms like plan obviously shift meaning when the element of time is absent, right? And for God's plan is for the outcome to occur. There's no interval between the decision and the completion, right? So it's not as if, like I said, God is stuck inside creation with us and is waiting to see what happens, right? Even on the human standpoint, right? The idea that chance is based on one's perspective, we can see that, right? So I can orchestrate an event. I can, send my son to the grocery store at a certain period of time and have my friend send his daughter to the grocery store at a certain period of time so they can bump into each other by chance. From their perspective, that was a chance encounter. From my perspective, it was orchestrated, right? And so, again, chance always depends on the perspective, and even more so when you have an atemporal being. Okay. All right. Now, what I find more interesting is what I'm going to spend more time talking about is the role that order has in evolution. Okay? So I'm going to try to make two claims. Right? The first is that evolution requires a huge amount of order to even get off the ground, right? So without this order, evolution doesn't work at all. And this order is a gift to evolution. The evolutionary process doesn't produce this. It just is, right? And this is go back to what Stephen Barr talked about earlier. Speaking about the order inherent in creation. And that order, science can explain it, describe it, but where does it come from? Why is it here? Those philosophical questions have to be answered outside of science. Right? So one is that order is absolutely essential for evolution. And two, that order actually influences the direction and the outcomes of evolution. Right? So evolution, to some extent, at least the outcomes are predictable. The timing, when they might occur, and exactly where, not so much because of the chance nature of things. But a lot of the outcomes of evolution are, I think, to a large extent, predictable. Okay? So, the question I like to pose to my students is, why does evolution work? Why does evolution work at all? Okay. Well, to have evolution, you have to have relatively stable organisms, complex entities. Right? So you have a picture of me here from, I think that's like 15 years ago. Right? And you can easily identify that as me, right? Nobody, it's got the same big nose that I had 15 years ago. It's the same sort of like really narrow eyes. So it's like as a physical being, I'm relatively stable, right? Not mentally, but physically, I'm relatively stable. Okay? I'm losing hair, other changes, but you can recognize it. Why is it that I am a stable entity, physically, right? And why is a bacteria relatively stable? It doesn't fluctuate in and out of existence, right? Well, the reason the bacteria are unstable is largely because the proteins that make me up are relatively stable. Okay? Now, proteins do deteriorate and do misfold and so forth, but there's ways to fix them, but they are relatively stable. So the proteins that make up my bone, my nose, and so forth are relatively stable, right? Why are these proteins stable? Why don't they just fluctuate in and out of existence? Right? Because they're made up of relatively stable elements. Right? And carbon atom is a carbon atom, is a carbon atom, is a carbon atom. And they're all the same. Right? C12 is the same. Whether it's in me, it's in a rock, right? It's being made in a star. Why is it that these are stable? And it's like, why do we have only 92 naturally occurring elements? Why do we have only 80 stable elements? Right? Why is that? Right? Why don't we live in a universe that's got 1,000 elements, or one? Right? Well, the reason that these things are stable, and we have these stable elements, is because, as Steve talked about, is because of the underlying order in the subatomic level, right? So, and you talk about how the strong nuclear force or the weak nuclear force, the size of the proton, the size of the electron, are all at very specific levels. We can measure what those levels are, and we can see what they are. We don't know, in a sense, why we live in a universe that has a strong nuclear force such that we can get those 80 elements that are stable, which allows us to have those proteins, which allows us to have organisms, right? So for evolution to work, to get these things here, right, you have to live in a rare universe that has a huge amount of order at this level, right? And if you change that a little bit, suddenly you have one stable element, or two stable elements, or no stable element, right? So this order, which is essential for this, is dependent upon this. And evolution doesn't produce, this is a gift to evolution. So that before evolution even gets off the ground, you have to have a specific type of universe that has a huge amount of order in it for evolution to work at all, okay? And that order is essential for evolution, right? Now, the second claim I'm going to make is that this order, not only does it allow evolution to get going, but it actually influences and dictates on some of the outcomes to a large extent, right? So, Father Terry talked about this yesterday, this idea of what would happen if you reran the tape of the evolutionary process on Earth again, right? So this is classic argument that was between two sort of different extremes. This one by Stephen Jay Gould that Father Terry put a quote up, and that is this idea that the world and evolution is entirely contingent, that these chance events dominate. So if we reran evolution again, that we had 1,000 Earths, we were able to run it 1,000 times, we get totally different outcomes every single time. Right? Because a meteor wouldn't hit the Earth at this point, you wouldn't have this mutation, all those chance events would change, and you get totally different outcomes. Right? On the other side is this view of evolution, and it's made popular by Simon Conway Morris, is this idea of convergence. Is that if we reran the tape of evolution again, right, you would get very similar types of forms. They might not occur at the same time. It might take longer to get this type of form, but you would get things that have bilateral symmetry, right? You would get things that take advantage of and are able to get energy from the sun, because the sun is a constant. You rerun that's a source of energy. Something's going to evolve to take advantage of that, right? You're going to get eyes, right, to be able to navigate and see what's around you. You're going to get certain things over and over again, not because they are just good solutions, right? They're good ways of making living, given the physics and chemistry of the Earth and of our universe, right? So how do you distinguish between these two possibilities, right? We can't rerun evolution 1,000 times, okay? But what you can do is look at what happened in this case and what happened during the last 4 billion years on this planet. Do you see large amounts of convergence? Do you see the same things evolving multiple times, right? Or is everything just sort of contingent in chance? And what you see, if you look at the evolutionary process, is that evolution is chock full of convergence. This book is one of my favorite book. I highly recommend this to anybody who's interested in this topic. Simon Conway Morris wrote this book. I think it came out around 2000. Life Solutions: Inevitable Humans in a Lonely Universe. Right? And his argument is that evolution is a highly convergent process. Given the physics and the chemistry of life on Earth, that if we reran evolution again, you would get lots of the same thing, right? And his book goes through all the examples of convergence that you see present in evolution in this instance that we have here on Earth. There's not a single sensory system that is not convergent, right? So echolocation evolved multiple times, like vision evolved multiple times, right? So multicellularity, it's evolved multiple times, right? So it's hard to find anything that has evolved just once, right? Convergence is the way in which evolution has gone, right? So, like one example is like mammals, like the mammal form, right? And this gets back to the whole sort of asteroid hitting, the meteor hitting the Yucatan Peninsula, right? So 65 billion years ago, right? When that event occurs, there's a mass extinction event. A lot of people say, well, that's when mammals take off, and it's the rise of the mammals. And so if that doesn't hit the Earth at that period of time, you never get the rise of mammals, you never get the rise of primates, and we wouldn't be here. We're only here because that meteor or asteroid hit the Earth and had that sort of chance event. What Morris would argue, and what I would argue, is that the mammalian form is such a good way of making a living that we know that the Earth is littered with mass extinction events. The environment is constantly changing. In a world where the environment is going to change, and you're going to have extinction events, being able to regulate your body temperature, being able to give birth to live young is going to be more beneficial in the long run than laying eggs and not being able to regulate your body temperature, right? And so the mammal form would eventually be found and set upon and evolve. The timing would have been different. If there hadn't been that extinction event 65 million years ago, the timing might be different, but you're still going to get to that, right? And if you look at like New Zealand, for example, right, there's no native mammals in New Zealand. Right? And what do you have? You have the kiwi bird, which is the official bird of New Zealand, but it's actually very mammalian-like. So it's nocturnal. If you look, its feathers look like hair. It doesn't lay many eggs, right? It scavenges at night. It's looking more like a rat in terms of the behavior. It's becoming sort of a small mammal. So the idea is that the mammalian way of making a living is going to be found evolutionarily at certain points because it's such a good way of making a living, right? So you see convergence everywhere. This is my favorite example of convergence. This is Shrek the donkey there, and you have this is a sheephead fish. and they're separated by a few 100 million years of evolution, but they have the same toothy grin right there. But you can see example after example of it. I want to give one example to you to illustrate this point before we switch over to look at human evolution, and that is protein evolution. And the reason I look at this is because I think this is the most drastic example of convergent evolution, right, that you can find. So, proteins are made of amino acids, right, which are strung together to make long strings that then fold into three-dimensional structures, right? And so if you look here at the protein, each one of these dots here, these balls, is a specific amino acid. There's about 20 amino acids that are biologically relevant. There's an infinite number of possible amino acids. There's only 20 that are biologically relevant. But if you say, how many possible proteins are there that organisms could make? Now let's just say, proteins are different lengths. Let's say, for sake of simplicity, how many possible 100 amino acid long proteins could you make? Well, that's going to be 20 to the 100th power. It's a huge, huge number. It's not a number that evolution can sample, right? So you think, if we reran evolution again, we get a totally different set of proteins, right? Because there's no way we're going to get the same proteins again because there's so many different possibilities, okay? But when you string amino acids together, right, they have this exact same backbone here. Right? What makes them different is what sticks off of them. But because they have that same backbone, when you string amino acids together, they will fold into only two stable secondary structures. That's it. Right? There's a few exceptions, but for the most part, it's basically two stable secondary structures. These helices, they form these little helices, alpha helices, and then these flat sheets, these beta sheets. So you have helices here on the left, sheets on the right. Why do they do that? Right? They do that because of the underlying chemistry. Right? That's the most stable way. You put them in an aqueous environment, this backbone tries to get away from water, and this is a stable arrangement of these things. Right? So if you reran evolution again, and you strung amino acids together, the chemistry is going to dictate you get alpha helices and the beta sheets again. You're still going to get these, right? So you have all this sort of infinite possibility of amino acid sequences, but because of the chemistry and physics that you're dealing with, you only get two really stable secondary structures. And then it turns out that there's only a limited way in which you really can put these together, because there's different rules and patterns of these loops of how you take alpha helices and beta sheets and put them together. And there's seems to be, at least, a limited number of protein folds that you can find. There's a limited ways you can put alpha helices and beta sheets together. Right? There are probably some more than 1,000, but there's roughly 1,000 different protein folds that you find in the protein fold database. If there's only a few that have been added to that in the last 10 years, or 20 years. Almost all, if somebody takes a new protein, crystallizes it, and see what's its structure, almost always matches one of the structures that's already in the database, right? And it's really interesting, like if you have a sandwich-like structure, right, the amino acid sequence can be totally different. There can be almost no homology on the amino acid sequence. So it's very highly, highly convergent, right? So the idea is that you rerun evolution again, you're going to end up with roughly the same protein chemistry, right? This huge amount of convergence. So I would say that we live in a very highly ordered universe as described by modern physics, what Steve R. talked about. Right? And that order is not only essential for evolution to work, it's not only a gift to evolution, but it also influences the direction and outcomes of evolution. Right? So these chance processes, these chance changes allow you to uncover what is going to work in the world that we find ourselves in. Right? It's a good way. It's almost like a chance search algorithm. That's often, so that's why evolutionary algorithms are a good programming model. It's based on chance, and you're able to get to an outcome in a relatively reasonable time frame. Okay, so for the last 15 minutes here or so, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions, I'm going to switch and start talking about human evolution, right? Getting back to that, okay? So as I mentioned at the beginning, you have this beautiful quote from Genesis, the Lord formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the life of earth. This unity of man, of body and spirit, right? And again, that means that we go through this, but we're not going to be able to explain the entirety of man through an understanding of the biological evolutionary process. And Benedict says, how do you get to where do you find the first man and the first theological human? He says, not in the use of weapons or fire or new methods of cruelty that constitute man, but rather his ability to be immediately in relation to God. All right? And then he says, herein lies the reason that anthropogenesis, like the first man, is not something that's going to be determined by paleontology. All right? Anthropogenesis, the origin of man, is not something that can be excavated with a shovel, the rise of the spirit. Right? Now, clearly, be able to determine if a fossil is in relation with God is not something we're going to be able to do. Right? But paleontology is going to be able to give us some information about roughly where and when maybe the first humans emerged and how they may or may not have behaved, right? So it gives us sort of some parameters to sort of speculate, right? Going back to what I talked about at the beginning. So that's what I want to do, right? So with this, I want to talk about from hominids to modern humans, right? So situate the environment in which modern humans emerge, right? Talk about the origin of modern humans, where might they have come from and when, and then we'll finish with monogenism and polygenism, the difference between the two and what the church talks about with this and why this is a debatable question. Okay. All right, so when hominids, first let's define what a hominid is. All right, so a hominid, if you look at this, this picture on the bottom, not good with my right to the left, especially when back. That's the left, okay? Bottom left, okay? If I were to put my finger down right here, right, on this tree, right, everything along this lineage is more similar to modern humans than it is to modern chimps and bonobos. These are all called hominids. We're looking at what's going on along this lineage here. So for you guys on this side, I'm going to put my finger down here. Anything that's on this lineage is considered a hominid. Okay, so we're looking at that evolutionary trajectory and what happened there. Okay? Now, before we get to that, I want to make the distinction between biological and theological humans, right? And we'll see how messy this gets. So, what does it mean to be human, right? Now, as a biologist or as a paleontologist, you're looking at it in a different way than a theologian. Right? Let's just make it clear there, right? So when I say, how do you know something is biologically human, right, in the fossil record, right, is not necessarily going to map one-to-one with how do you know something is theologically human, right? Okay. So how do we know something's biologically human? We pull up a fossil. How would you know? And what are you going to look for? What characteristics do you think is going to be distinctly human?
The bipedal.
Okay, they're bipedal, but a
not
lot of other hominids, you're right. So they definitely have to be obligatory bipedal. So there's going to be, in the hominid lineage, you're going to see lots of changes point out to the pelvic girdle and the femur and so forth, and the foot that's going to be moving to bipedal locomotion.
Shape of the forehead.
Okay, the shape of the forehead is going to change, but again, some of the hominids are going to have the shape of the forehead that looks very, very similar. In fact, there's a hominid that was found that's dated about 30,000 years ago that has a forehead that's very, very similar to modern humans, but wouldn't be considered a modern human. Okay, upright, but there's a lot of other hominids. The key, usually, right? Oh,
How would you say the ratio of the skull size to the overall organism?
yeah, so the brain size is largely the best predictor, right? Okay, so it's not the only thing, but having a large brain is sort of the key. Looking at the skull, a large brain and a small jaw, right? And having a brain of a sufficient size and saying, okay, that is most likely a modern human. Okay? So just to put it in perspective, the common ancestor of modern humans and modern chimps had a brain probably, again it's speculative because there aren't that many fossils from that period, is about 400 cc's. Okay, so a can of Coke is like 330, I think, so it's a little bit more than a can of Coke. You guys in this room have brain sizes closer to 12 to 14, depending on how big you are. So you're up to 3 cans of Coke. So you see that's the change in brain size that you have. But it's not only the size of the brain, it's the shape of the brain and the ratio of the brain to the body size. okay? That is probably, and again, it's not, we'll see, it gets messy here, but that's probably the best predictor of, okay, that thing is close enough to us that I consider it a modern human, okay? Theologically, how would you know something is theologically human? How would you know this thing is made in the image and likeness of God? That this thing is able to have conceptual thought, rational thought, is able to worship God, right? Well, from the fossil record, probably not going to be able to tell much, right? But from the archaeological record, you might be able to, right? So the artifacts that people make or you find are going to suggest that, oh, whoever made this thing had rational conceptual thought, right? So if somebody, our civilization goes extinct and somebody lands on Earth and finds, the statue of David, right? Michelangelo's David, whatever, whoever took the time to do this has rational conceptual thought, right? So there are artifacts that can help you suggest when that might have occurred. Okay? So let's first look at biologically when humans might have emerged, and then we'll look at theologically. Okay? Right. The first thing to keep in mind is that the lineage of the hominid lineage is not like a bumper sticker. Right? It's not just neat lineage where something gradually stands up. Right? It's a mess. Right? It's a complex, bushy tree where it is really hard to often see which and how different hominid fossils are related to other hominid fossils. All right? There are, people that will split two groups of fossils into two separate species. There's others that will lump them together. But there's a lot of question marks. Right? But there is clearly a huge amount of these intermediary transition forms. And in general, and this is a huge oversimplification, I'd break hominid evolution into three phases, okay? So you have the first phase at the base of a hominid tree, and that would be from like 7 million years to about 4 million years, this here. Again, at this point, hominids are only in Africa, and there's very few of them in the fossil record. We don't have much from 7 to 4 million years, right? They, at that point, don't seem to be obligatory bipedal. There are some adaptations in some of the, actually there's only one really that you have a nice, this is Arden fossils, you have nice pectoral and leg fossils from, but you don't have much to go on. The next phase, this is where you have a large amount of fossils to go on. This is African diversification from 4 million to about 2 million years, right? And in that period, you have large amounts of hominid fossils that you find in Africa, right? Particularly East Africa. And in that period, right, if you look, that's where the genus Homo emerges, right? And as you can see in this sort of picture here, I'm not going to go through all the different fossil forms, but you can see there's a lot of question marks and how do they relate to each other? It's not really clear, right? So some of these fossils, in one respect, look more human. So some of them might look, hey, they look more modern because they have a larger brain. But when you look at their jaw is really large as well. While another one has a smaller brain but has a small jaw. So in its jaw, this one looks more modern, but in its brain, this other one looks more modern, and they're contemporaneous, right? So seeing where, how humans and other hominids emerge out of this is there's a lot of debate about this. But clearly, there's a huge amount of evolutionary change and exploration of the hominid form going on in Africa 4 to 2 million years ago. Okay? Then the last 2 million years is the waves out of Africa. Right? And this is the most interesting period. This is when you see hominids moving out of Africa. And there's roughly 3 waves, but it's not, this is again a gross oversimplification. So it's not like there's a little gate there. Sign up and just, all right, first grade, over. It's like a hockey run. Everybody over the board, out there, and then shut it, wait, we'll bring the next wave out, right? But you start to see the first wave out is Homo erectus. And Homo erectus leaves Africa somewhere close to 1.2 million years ago, migrates through the Middle East, to Asia and East Asia. They don't end up in Europe, right? The second wave out of Africa are the Neanderthals. Right? So they emerge about 500 million years ago, 600 million years ago. They moved into the Levant, the Middle East, the Caucasus, and into Europe. And then the last wave out of Africa is modern humans. Right? And modern humans, start to leave Africa roughly, I mean, again, there's a lot of debate about this, probably around 100,000 years ago. You start to see they're interacting in the Levant and so forth, but there is a huge wave that leaves around 50,000 years ago, and that's the wave that basically spread throughout the entire globe. So humans are going in and out of Africa, but about 50,000 years you get a major wave, 50,000 years leaving and going throughout the rest of the globe. Right? But it's clear, based on the fossil record, that modern humans must have emerged in Africa. Because the oldest hominid fossils are modern human fossils are in Africa. But there's a lot of debate about where and how they emerged, okay? So, going back to what I was talking about, how do you know something is a human fossil, right? So these pictures up here, okay? And if you look at, let's see, look at these two over here, C and D. These are Neanderthal fossils in A and B. C and D are human fossils. Right? So up until about 6 years ago, the oldest modern human fossils that everybody agreed upon were these ones that are 200,000 years ago in Ethiopia. Now we thought, okay, these are the oldest modern human fossils. They're in East Africa. They have a brain size and a brain shape that's almost identical to modern humans. Probably, biologically speaking, can be classified as modern humans. Right? Well, but 6 years ago, there is a fossil find in Morocco. So now we're on the other side of the continent. Okay, you're looking at northwest Africa. And that is C. So if you look at C, okay, those are the fossils that are found in Morocco. And D are modern human fossils. Right? The brain size is about the same. There really isn't much difference in the brain size, but the brain shape is quite different. So if you look at C, you can see it's a lot flatter. Right? The brain case is flatter, more spread out, where modern human is more globular. Right? And so if you look at the brain organization, it's clearly different. So the question is that a modern human? There is no unambiguous way to answer that question. Right? So, most paleontologists argue, yeah, that is modern human. It's got enough similarities, but it clearly has a different brain shape, right, than we do, right? So, this is showing how difficult it is to recognize something as a modern hominid. So, I'm sorry, this is a little bit bigger. You can see a little bit better here. So, C versus D, you can see how C is a little flatter and more elongated, where D is more globular. Okay. Now, what makes things even more difficult, and this goes back to what we talked about speciation yesterday, and wanted to jump in and do it now, right? There is no unambiguous way for biologists to identify the species. Right? This is the species problem, right? So the idea that a species is an interbreeding population, well, that works for the most part, but at the margins it usually doesn't work. So humans, is well established, as they left Africa, interacted with Neanderthals. The Neanderthals were in the Levant, they were in Europe when humans migrate out, and they interbred with them. Not only they interbred, but it looks like they not only interbred, but produced fertile offspring. We found bones where it's 1/8 Neanderthal, 7/8 human, which means it must be third generation down. So this is clearly they interbred with Neanderthals. And every person who is any non-African has remnants of Neanderthal DNA in their genome. Okay? And that's what you see down here. It's looking at this, you can see that divergence here. You can see the African divergence from Neanderthals, where there is less divergence here for Europeans, East Oceanic people, and people that live in the East Asians, right? So as they left Africa, they must have mated with Neanderthals, picked up some genes that might have been beneficial for whatever, dealing with cold climates, whatever pathogens might have been there that were actually beneficial. And if we were to sequence all of our genomes, you'd find 1 to 2% of your genes probably came from Neanderthals. They're going to be different from different people. Like, so the 1 to 2% I have versus the 1 to 2% that you have, I have Neanderthal DNA that's for different genes than maybe you do. But you do see that, right? So are Neanderthals and humans different biological species, right? Well, most people argue yes, even though at the biological species definition, it clearly doesn't fit that nice and neat.
And you can't, like, brains don't fossilize, so like the shape of the skull doesn't necessarily mean that their internal brain organization is.
Right, exactly. So the brain doesn't fossilization, but you can get an idea of, okay, this is sort of the shape of the brain, but how it all connects, you don't, you make assumptions based on what we know about brains. So, but again, it's an assumption that you're not sure of, right? Because you don't get a brain to fossilize, unfortunately. Okay, so then how do you find theological humans? Okay, so this becomes even more difficult. Right? But John Paul II pointed out that you can discern something from experimental research about this, right? And he says the moment of passage into the spiritual realm is not something that can be observed in this way. He's talking about observed in an empirical way, from a scientific perspective. Although we can nevertheless discern through experimental research a series of very valuable signs of what is specifically human life. And this is where he's talking about the artifacts. Certain artifacts that if you find them, you're pretty sure that whoever did this is just like you and I, has rational conceptual thought, made in the image and likeness of God. Okay? So what does the evidence show on this end? Right? So as I mentioned, the oldest biological human remains are between 200 and 300,000 years old in Africa. Okay? So where do you start to see signs in the archaeological record that suggest conceptual rational thought? Okay? Now first of all, this does not mean that humans emerged at the signs of the first archaeological signs. It could have been doing conceptual rational thought well before that and just never got around to painting caves. Right? But you start to see key signs of human culture roughly around 100,000 years ago. All right? And when I say this, you see things that suggest rational, high-level conceptual thought. The interesting thing about this, and I'll show some pictures of these on the next slide, is that it doesn't start necessarily in one place. Not at all. It all starts here. You start to see this crop up in different areas. You see it in South Africa, you see some in the Middle East, you see some in East Africa. So it's not like, well, here's where human civilization emerged, but this is the location, right? And then, about 50,000 years ago, you start to see another level of sort of complexification of human artifacts. And again, this one is not located in one specific region. 50,000 years, almost immediately it crops up in Africa, in Europe, and in Far East Asia, right? So it's everywhere, right? So again, how this came to be, it's not clear. But this just gives you some ideas. Here are some of the things that have been dated to 50 to 100,000 years, right? So you can see these shells that were found in South Africa, the one was cave, where you have what is thought to be sort of decorative jewelry. There's these shells have been drilled in the exact same spot. You see ochre with these sort of markings on them here. In Africa, you see sort of blades that you have a hafting technique, not just a sharpened blade, but it's been attached to something, right? So you're trying to conceptualize A to B, to visualize a product as you're starting to see how these things might come together. There's got to be some sort of offline conceptual thinking. Okay, this is what I'm going to get. Right? So these types of things start to appear throughout Africa at this time. 50,000 years ago, you start to see much more complex things, right? And then you see these again all over the globe, right? This figurine here is from Africa. This cave painting here is from Indonesia. These two cave paintings here are from France. And so you see them, and they're all dated roughly around between 40 and 50,000 years ago, right? And you see it all over the globe. So I think what this certainly suggests is that theological humans are at least 100,000 years old. Right? And they most likely emerged in Africa, and again, which jives with biological humans. Right? The oldest biological humans are in Africa, 200 to 300,000 years ago. But they might not necessarily map on top of each other. Right? To make things a little bit more complex, is that you do see signs of symbolic artwork. This is attributed to Neanderthals. Okay? So this is a cave painting from southern France. It's been dated, because they can date these little deposits, mineral deposits that have seeped through the rock and are on top of the painting. So if they can date these, they know the painting's got to be older than that, right? And so this painting is dated to, I believe, like close to 60,000 years ago. And modern humans weren't in this region of Europe until about 50,000 years ago. So this predates modern humans getting there, right? So whoever made this, did this person have rational conceptual thought, right?
this person theologically human. It's possible that Neanderthals are theologically human, right? That's certainly a possibility. They have rational conceptual thought, right? They were, that they made it to some extent with modern humans, right? Or it's possible that maybe they're imitating something they saw or whatnot. Maybe they don't. You know, it's debatable, but it makes it much more. You know, it's not an easy answer here. Okay. All right. The last thing I want to talk about is, and I'll spend a few minutes on this, is monogenism versus polygenism. Right? So this is the idea. What you got? If modern humans emerge in Africa, how do they emerge? They emerge from a couple. They emerge from a population. Okay? So from a theological perspective, right, Catholic theological tradition suggests that humans emerged from an initial pair, right, who fell from grace and gave rise to all theological humans. Right? We all descend from an original couple. It makes the notion of original sin very simple to explain. Right? What's the problem with that from a biological perspective? So, from a biological perspective, the amount of diversity that you find in humans currently, right, is way more than you would have if humans emerged from a population of two, right? So, anytime there's a bottleneck in a population, the population goes down to a certain number of individuals, emerges down to 500 individuals that survive some event, that leaves a huge genetic signature that you can see for hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years for that population, right? And so looking at the genetic diversity you see in human population, knowing how much mutations and so forth occur, if you look back and do these models, and large numbers of independent models have been looked at, looking at different types of genetic variation, really the human population probably never went below. Probably the smallest estimate is like 500. Most likely, the human population never went below an interbreeding population of 1,000. Right? So how do you get to a population of 2? Biologically, it doesn't make sense. Okay? Not to mention sort of the inbreeding issues and all that you have from a population of 2. Right? So what does the church say about this? So the only encyclical that mentions this is Humani Generis in 1950. And he says, Pope Pius XII says, for the faithful cannot embrace that opinion which maintains that either after Adam there existed on this earth true men who did not take their origin through natural generation from him as from the first parent of all, or that Adam represents a certain number of first parents. Right? So this seems to caution against speculating on polygenism. Right? Now he does say the faithful. He doesn't say you can't. He says the faithful cannot embrace that opinion. He doesn't say you can't speculate upon that. And in fact, as Chris mentioned yesterday, that he deliberately chose these softer words rather than saying this is banning speculation on this. Right? And so I think the key thing is, why did he say that? You know, the reason, it's not like he cares whether it's polygenism, monogenism, it all depends on the original sin. He said it's no way apparent how polygenism can be reconciled with the doctrine of original sin. So if you can figure out how to reconcile polygenism with original sin, it doesn't seem to be, there's no inherent theological problem with that. Okay? So I just want to give you one way of thinking about this, and this is the same person that wrote, is publishing his book with Catholic Youth Press, Dr. Kenneth Kemp. He wrote an article back in 2011 that proposes a way to think about this, okay? And so the way he thinks about this is making, again, the distinction between biological and theological humans, right? Theological humans are those that are made in the image and likeness of God, have a rational soul, that are able to have conceptual thought. A biological human would be something that can reproduce with us, right? Which is quite different, right? So he says you have an initial couple here. And again, I'm not advocating for this model. What I'm doing is a speculation to say, okay, here's one way of looking at it. I think there's other ways of looking at it. But you have this original couple that emerges through the evolutionary process. It's made in the image and likeness of God. They fall, right? Their offspring, these black circles and squares here, then mate with biological humans, right? These other hominid populations that are around them. And clearly humans did, not only with Neanderthals, but clearly it seems to happen. Most models of human evolution don't argue that there's one African population that spread to the others. This African population where humans might have emerged started to interact with other African populations and interbred with them, right? So the idea is, if you have one theological human parent, the offspring are theologically human, right? And again, it's not like it's inherited, but if you have one theological parent, your offspring has the type of thing that is fitting to have a rational soul, right? Whether, the whole point is here, this is sort of a hybrid model where you have an initial pair, but you have all this genetic variability coming in from the hominid population, the biological human population around you. That's one way of thinking about this. Okay? So, just in conclusion, and we open up for questions, synthesizing the science of theology, it's clear that the oldest biological humans have been found in Africa. Exactly when and how you want to date that depends upon the preference of the paleontologist. I didn't talk about this, but looking at genetic information, mitochondrial Eve, which is looking at how old is the mother of all of us, that dates to about the same time, 200 to 150,000 years ago, right? So it's interesting, the fossil record and the genetic record sort of converge at this date about 200,000 years ago, right? However, you don't see signs of rational conceptual thought until about 100,000 years ago. Now, doesn't mean it didn't exist there, you just don't see signs of it until 100,000 years ago, right? So the argument is that those biological beings that were fitting to receive a rational soul, right, that emerged from an evolutionary process that were the type of things from all eternity that God intended to have a rational soul emerged in Africa relatively recently, spread throughout the globe, which interacted with and displaced other hominids. Right? What happened to those interbreeding pairs, whether they were theological humans, you can speculate till the cows come home on that. But I think it sort of situates sort of our understanding of hominid evolution, and I'll end there and open up for questions.
Who would like the first question today? Go ahead.
So I have a question about some possible research that might be going on or could go on. I'm just curious, with regard to mutations, as chance events, is there any kind of research going on, what kind might there be, of maybe trying to figure out if there is some kind of, if possibly mutations might be less chance events than we think? Like, in other words, that there might be some kind of interplay between different genetic
sure.
environmental factors that could trigger mutations in certain conditions, so that those mutations might be responses to alterations in the environment and therefore might be more orderly than chance than we currently think?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. And I think the mutations are not random, they are chance. But chance events, there could be some patterns in chance events, right? There's certain patterns, things are more likely than others. I think that's clearly the case, right? There are certain mechanisms, particularly bacteria, where they have response systems in challenging environments where they can increase their mutation rate. And they can also, you see mutations occur often in genes that are actually being turned on. So in an organism, there's certain genes that might be not being used as much. The genes that are being transcribed at a higher rate tend to mutate at a higher rate, which is interesting because those might be more important for survival. They might mutate more. It's not as if it's just that they're more exposed because they're turned on and they're being transcribed. And then interestingly, there's a really cool paper that came out about a year ago now. It was looking at malaria and, the hemoglobin gene that's associated with resistance to malaria, right? And sickle cell. And it's a very interesting paper because what they did is they were looking for de novo mutations. So they looked at sperm in Africans that are in malarial infested environment versus, I think it was Caucasians that, from Europe, right? And when you look at sperm, you can see, okay, you can track new mutations, right? So if you knew what my sequence was, and then you sequence a bunch of like sperm, you would be able to say, oh, that's a new mutation that just occurred, because I don't have it, but the sperm does, right? And they found that there were more new mutations in one specific hemoglobin gene that actually is protective of malaria in the African population that's exposed to malaria, right? How did that, and there's a lot of speculation of how and why and debate about that. But I think there is certain, patterns that with the organism can respond to the environment in certain ways. And it's not as if it knows, but I think there's sort of patterns where certain genes might be in certain environments. It's kind of like a transcription. When transcription is more active, that gene is more likely to mutate, which might be more beneficial in that environment since that gene is being used more. So there certainly is. And then there is, different repair pathways that are more effective on certain genes and less effective. So organisms have very ordered responses to the environment, and that then shifts, it becomes less chancy in a sense. Right? So I think, and there's a lot that we don't know about that. Right? But it's,
Thank you. I remember learning about a type of evolution that has only been studied in the past 50 years of like the non-coding genes. I don't know if you know about that. Like if there's been any more research. Like in the I can't remember if it's just like the areas between genes that are just not coding for
Yeah.
proteins. If there's evolution occurring through those.
yeah, so, right, so if you sequence the human genome, roughly 95% of it is this intergenic region. In between genes, it's sort of non-coding, doesn't code for a protein. But those regions are very important for, one, the way the DNA folds in terms of protecting different genes, and for regulating, turning on. There's like what are called enhancers and suppressors in there that will turn on and off certain genes. So there's a large amount of sort of evolutionary change that goes on in that leads to phenotypic change. So a lot of change, so it is particularly in early development. So if you turn on a gene that's maybe important for neuron production, right? If that gene is not mutated, but you alter the intergenic region, make that gene turn on more, you make more of the neurons, right? So that intergenic region is very key to changing the level or the timing, right? We'll change the timing, and that changes development, right? That's the thing, is like humans, there's clearly a developmental timing change of the brain compared to other primates, right? Where our brain is really much developing after birth, and it's developing for a longer period of time than the brain of a chimp, right? And that's probably largely a result of these type of changes. The protein hasn't changed as much as the turning on of other genes, right?
Any further questions? You can say.
Catholic Christian.
Can you just wait a second? Richard, can you hear him when he's talking? Yep.
Catholic Christian, what is your personal stance for where theological meaning is developed? Does it or should it matter where in the sequence the theological meaning is?
Deacon Tim, can you repeat that just a little bit louder? Richard said they couldn't hear you.
As a Catholic Christian man, what is your personal stance for where theological meaning is developed? Does it or should it matter where in the sequence theological meaning is developed?
Yeah, it doesn't matter where in the sequence. I think the only thing that matters to me in terms of the sequence is, does it make sense sort of scientifically, right? So I don't think it makes sense scientifically to say that modern humans developed 20,000 years ago. It doesn't make sense in terms of having all modern humans united by common descent. And I also don't think it makes sense to say modern humans or theological humans emerged 1 million years ago, because I think that you don't have sort of the clear signs of what is a theological human. So I think that in that sense it does, but I don't think we will ever identify exactly when and where theological humans emerge, because they're not going to leave something for us to discover in the archaeological or fossil record necessarily. But I think if again, with what I outlined, I think it seems pretty likely that it's somewhere between 300 and 100,000 years ago in Africa, where the first theological humans would have emerged, and that we all share genetic common ancestry with that initial population or group.
This is more of a teacher asking from a teaching standpoint. I don't know if you encounter this problem at the university level, but when I start to teach my sophomores, we come into evolution and natural selection. how do you handle the staunch pushback that no, I was taught that we came from Adam and Eve, and there's no way whatsoever that we are genetically linked with any other, I mean, I have some kids that are just like, I'm gonna tell my mom and dad what you said, and I'm like, please do. Please do. How do you
Yeah, they-
encounter that, or how do you?
Yeah, I don't
handle
get
that?
threatened that they're gonna tell mom and dad. But I do get that, right? And again, I teach at a relatively Orthodox Catholic university, and so most of the students that I teach are relatively Orthodox Catholic. So what I do is I give them, and I always start, because when I teach the biology majors, I don't have no issue, right, with that. It's when I teach the non-majors, and I teach evolution to non-majors, that's where I get all these problems. Nothing wrong with other majors, just not as good. But I always start with Benedict. Right, and so I say, well, you start with church documents. Okay, this is what, because it's just like once, it's harder for them to argue with Benedict than it is with me, right? You're an idiot. You don't know what you're talking about. But it's harder as an Orthodox Catholic for them to throw Benedict or John Paul II under the bus. Right? Some do, but you know that's their decision. But that's why I always start. Let's frame this. What does the church has said about this? And give them, you know, a few quotes, slides. I give them part of in the beginning to read, you know, and I think just to free up that space. Okay, this isn't necessarily heretical, right? Because a lot of them come from not a lot, but there is a significant minority that do come from that, even Catholics that come from that background. So. Being in a Catholic school, you're not going to have all Catholics, but you know it does. I think that helps. That's the only way I have ever made headway with them. Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Okay. I have two which is somebody else behind me?
I don't know who.
I don't want to make that decision.
I was just gonna ask, are there any working theories on the cause of the contemporaneous explosion of major advances in the separate human populations 40 to 50,000 years ago? You had mentioned East Asia and Africa.
Yeah.
You start seeing the same type of cultural explosion, but without a reason, perhaps. Are there any working theories on what?
Yeah, no, I think the working theory is that there is like sort of exchange between populations. Like you get this idea of like humans are migrating out of Africa. It's a one-way street. There's people going back and forth. There's migration between, you know, humans are moving. You know, we should be Homo wanderericis, whatever. Humans just wander. They go and explore everything, and they're moving back and forth. And so if you think about human culture starting, well, this group figured out this group figured out, and that all, you know, eventually you reach a critical mass where there's enough of culture that it expands rapidly, and to move culture from Africa to Asia could take 1,000 years at most, which is instantaneous, right? So I think that's probably what happened. You've got like culture, you know, pieces of it popping up, and finally you get a critical mass that it spreads everywhere, right? And shows up all at once.
Brian, you said you had like two questions. Is there one that's like shorter than the
Well,
other?
they're both just clarifying questions.
Yeah.
They're simpler questions. The easiest one is, my wife's from Kenya, so when I heard you say every non-African human has remnants of Neanderthal DNA, I was like, well, is my wife more biologically human than me? So I'm curious
We are
where
more
you
than our
stand on that.
DNA. We are more than our DNA.
But so that was an easy one.
Yeah.
At the beginning of your talk, when you're talking about like plasticity and those things, I was wondering about, do individual organisms evolve, or is that something that populations do and groups do? Even when you're talking about plasticity and like, oh, these, it's not acquired traits that are being passed on to heritable ones, right?
Right, so the plasticity, right, so the individual organisms don't evolve as the population does. But as like an organism adapts to its new environment, right, the so the organism has the ability to take on slightly different forms, and those forms emerge. That now makes certain different mutations beneficial that, before they wouldn't. So the idea is that phenotypic change sometimes precedes the genetic change that hardwires that later on, right? And so as my form changes, now the mutations, the effect that they would have had in this form is different than the effect they would have here in this form, right? And so, technically individuals don't evolve, but they do change over time, but that's not evolution, right? In the sense that we're talking about biological evolution.